back. Welcome. And, our last couple stops on the Abbott and Costello filmography have been a little choppy, Coming Around the Mountain is definitely the weakest film of theirs we've reviewed so far. But I felt like they bounced back a bit with Jack and the Beanstalk. It had a renewed energy, and while it's not a perfect film, you can definitely see that they are having a lot more fun, and there's a little bit more originality being put on display. Before their next independent release would come out, which I believe they filmed right after this one, there is another Universal picture released in between the two, that being, of course, this film, Lost in Alaska. And I can't help but notice, and I mentioned this in the Coming Round the Mountain reviews, that as we are now into the final stages of the boys' film career, that we have regressed a bit. We're back to the formula that seemed to benefit them in their early careers. We're back to, shoehorned in musical numbers, lighter plots. The boy-girl A-plots are less. It does definitely feel like those are more there to service Bud and Lou than they were in the early days. But it's easy to see how the studio is probably thinking that, again, they're in the later stages of their career. They've been around for a long time. They've released a ton of movies, a lot of which, I think I mentioned this in one of the previous reviews, but it bears repeating. A lot of their older films have been re-released by this stage. So one of the things that they had to do with a lot of the promotional material was, on the posters, they had to say things like a brand new adventure or all new comedy, so that younger viewers could understand that this was a new film and not just a re-release of an old film. So, it stands to reason. Again, as they're entering the later stages, the studio probably wants them to go back and, go with what was working. Again, this is the Abbott and Costello meets portion of their career, where Bud and Lou are a brand unto themselves, and you can market an entire film around just Abbott and Costello go to a place, do a thing, or meet a person. So we're beginning to see, and we saw it with Coming Round the Mountain, that the films, I don't feel, are as creative as they once were. That wonderful renaissance that kind of came about in the Little Giant, Time of Their Lives meets Frankenstein era, that has faded, and we're going back to what had worked, what's familiar. And that's not an entirely bad thing, especially for a team that has been around for this long and has made this much content. We'll talk about this at a later time, but, it's not just the movies that these guys are doing. Bud and Lou have a small empire of stuff that they have been a part of. They've been working consistently for a long time, so it's hard to keep coming up with new concepts. So, as we go into these later films, what we're going to find is trying to recapture the magic of stuff that had worked before, and it has varying levels of success. So with all of that said, where does Lost in Alaska fall on that scale? And I feel that Lost in Alaska is a decent enough outing for the boys. It is not anywhere near as bad as Coming Around the Mountain was. Few things are going to be. It does lack a lot of the energy and that feeling of creativity that some of their other films have, but it is much more interesting in its plot and has a much more interesting premise than some of the films that they've had to do. So let's talk about this one a little bit. So what is the story? Well, in this film, Bud and Lou play volunteer firemen in San Francisco who save a man from drowning, and the man turns out to be a prospector from Alaska who struck a pretty big vein, but he doesn't want the money. He doesn't, in fact, want to live anymore because his girlfriend, a saloon singer, has dumped him. So this guy is now suicidal. Laugh riot there. We'll talk about that in a second. But Bud and Lou are determined to save him, and they keep him alive long enough for him to get a note from his girlfriend saying she wants him back. To reward Bud and Lou, he gives them a bag full of gold. Well, through sheer shenanigans and happenstance, people believe that Bud and Lou actually murdered this guy and stole his gold. So Bud and Lou, to prove their innocence, hop a freighter to Alaska to get this guy to come back with them and prove that they didn't kill him and that, he is in fact alive and therefore they don't have to go to jail. This proves to be a difficult task when they get to Alaska and find that this guy has enemies just about everywhere. He owes money. People just want to murder him left, right, and center. So these guys are now tasked with the mission of keeping a guy alive whom everybody in the territory wants to murder. So right away, there's a lot of good material here to mine for comedic effect, and they do it fairly well. We gotta talk. One thing I noticed watching this movie is just how much we've evolved as a society, and what we thought was funny back in the day versus what we don't think is funny now, or what we the concept of this movie being based around a man trying to commit suicide, and one of the first major plot points and one of the major comedy bits in this is Bud and Lou having to take shifts to watch this guy at night while he sleeps to make sure he doesn't do anything to hurt himself. And Bud keeps setting the clock ahead and, waking Lou up and making him take his shift, telling him that, time has passed. That this is all based around a man committing suicide. Back then in comedies, suicide was just a laugh riot. Like, they just thought this was the funniest thing ever. And this is not the only comedy to deal with that. I mean, hell, a little bit ago, I saw an old Warner Brother cartoon where two mice are spending the entire cartoon trying to get a cat to eat them. And this was apparently, an extremely funny situation to them. Compare this to modern sensibilities, correct sensibilities. I have to say, this is not me going, oh, we're too PC now. No, this is me saying, I watched a show this past week where one of the characters commits suicide, and they put a warning thing up before the episode and said, hey, this deals with this. If this is not, you need to be warned. It's if you're sensitive to it, you need to be aware. I know that, of course, these films are decades old, and not just these films, but all of the movies of this era. I'm a big fan of Turner Classic Movies, but you watch anything from the 40s, the 30s, or whatever, and you do so with the knowledge that society is different. Morals have evolved in most cases, and what you are seeing is very much a product of its time. It's something we've had to talk about, especially in relationship to the portrayal of other cultures and minorities in films like this, which we're going to have to talk about with this movie. But this is one of the first times when I've ever really looked at one of these and gone, oh my God, they really thought this was funny. This guy trying to kill himself was like a laugh riot. It's not a judgment. It's a reflection on just how much society has changed. And hopefully for the better. But yeah, so anyway, that's a long rant to go on about this early plot point, but it was something that really struck me. I will say that the mileage they get out of it, especially with the trying to keep watch scene is pretty good. I enjoyed that little bit. It was something new. It's not a bit I've seen in an Abbott and Costello film before. So they did it very, very well, and has a nice payoff. I also think that the idea of Bud and Lou needing to keep a guy alive whom everybody in the world wants to kill is a pretty funny thing to hang the plot of a movie on. There's a lot you can do with that. And I feel like, no pun intended, since it's in Alaska, I feel like they mine that kind of halfway. They get some good mileage out of it early on, but then they almost kind of forget about that plot point once Abbott and Costello actually get lost in Alaska, once they actually, fulfill the promise of the title. And that whole sequence is actually pretty good too. When Abbott and Costello are actually lost in Alaska and wandering around trying to survive, they're fishing, they're freezing and stuff like that. It's a little reminiscent of a similar scene of them lost in the desert in the Foreign Legion, but obviously now in the frozen tundra. So, I think they get some decent mileage out of it. They have some fun with what little people knew about Alaska at the time, and it's not like y'all from the lower 48 are dripping with knowledge of my home state now. I mean, some of the questions I get asked by my students, quite frankly, really makes me concerned for the American education system. But, however, I digress. It's funny, kind of the depiction of Alaska, is it feels like this is more of a Western than, actually set in Alaska, which I guess when the film is set, I think the film is set in the 1910s, I think, the 1800s, 1918, I think, or something around there, but judging by the costume. So obviously there's not a lot known about Alaska at that point, and, you knew things like dog sleds and things like that. So they have fun with kind of the Alaska tropes, the king crabs, there's a bit in there with a very, very, very cheap looking bear, which I'm pretty sure they got on loan from Santa Claus Conquers the Martians. There's a fun bit where Bud and Lou are rounding up stray dogs to be their dog sled team. And, so they've got all these different sized dogs and a little dog who's kind of suspended and he's just waving his legs. It's funny. I wonder how cruel it was to the dogs, but it was a pretty funny bit. So I think they mined a lot of the potential there in this new location and this new concept. But I do feel like they lose the thread of it towards the climax of the film, and the climax just kind of putters into place and doesn't really resolve anything. It just kind of happens. Another chase between our main bad guy trying to kill the prospector. The whole subplot about the prospector and his girlfriend getting back together, and she might be conning him, and all of this. It's not. That whole section is not very interesting, I'll be honest. The plot is not interesting. It gives some good opportunities for some comic mischief, but all taken as a whole, it just doesn't really string together. And I feel like that's something we're seeing happen more and more with these later Abbott and Costello films, is that as opposed to a coherent story like Little Giant, like Time of Their Lives, or even Meets Frankenstein, we're getting back a little bit to the stuff just kind of happens. And it doesn't really make a connection. It doesn't really follow a logical plot thread. It's just, okay, here's the next thing that happens. And it leaves you with a little bit of a letdown feeling. There is, of course, I feel like we do have to talk about this. So yeah, there is a bit in the tribe of a group of Alaskan natives. It's about as culturally sensitive as any film could be regarding the subject in 1952. I don't think it's as offensive as, say, the indigenous folks represented in Ride 'em Cowboy, but it's pretty bad. I'm sorry. It just I can't fault them too much on that, because again, it was that time, it was that place. It was also Alaska, and its native people were something that, again, folks just didn't know about. They were going off the not altogether reliable, real life adventure footage that they were getting back from, people who went up there and filmed stock footage. So, you can't necessarily blame them for poor representation, because they didn't know any better. Literally, they did not know what was going on, so they were just kind of filling in the blanks as they saw fit. Doesn't make it okay, it's just an explanation. I guess the other thing to talk about briefly are their co-stars. Again, we're taking some steps back in supporting cast, especially since Jack and the Beanstalk had a really nice supporting cast. We had a really good group of alumni. This one, not so much. The main characters, aside from Bud and Lou, are, of course, the prospector played by Tom Ewing. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce his name for some reason. And his saloon singer girlfriend, Mitzi Green. Mitzi Green, of course, was a child actor. Played Becky Thatcher in both The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. She was also one of the first people to play Little Orphan Annie. Not in the musical, but in a film version of the comic strip. So she'd been around Hollywood for a while. She's playing our bar singer. I'm sad to say, the music is nowhere up to the standards of the Andrews Sisters. And they've had other great musical acts work with them, aside from the Andrews Sisters, but the Mitzi Green, lovely woman, but just not quite up to that level. And her voice, she's got a very raspy voice, which isn't a bad thing. It just the songs are uninspired, uninteresting. They're just there, and you feel like a lot like you're watching one of the early Bud and Lou films. You're like, oh, a musical number that has no bearing on anything and isn't memorable in any way. Oh, great. Tom Ewell, the problem with him is, I believe from the research I did, is he was another comedian, to my knowledge. He was in a lot of comedies. But I got this feeling like he was constantly trying to upstage Lou. Like he was trying to do his funny faces and his funny acting, as opposed to playing it straight and letting Bud and Lou have the comedy. It felt like he was really fighting to be like the third stooge, and that ain't gonna work with Lou Costello, buddy. That is just not gonna happen. Joe Besser can hang with Bud and Lou. Shemp Howard can hang with Bud and Lou. Dick Powell can hang with Bud and Lou. You cannot. And I think, I feel like that's because, and this is just observation, I have no documents or anything to back this up. But again, it felt like he was trying to upstage Lou. He was trying to be the funny one in the scenes. And that, again, that's just not going to work. That's just not going to work with Lou Costello. And it's not that Lou Costello is ever, in my opinion, just watching all these films and knowing them as well as I do and rewatching them with this more critical eye, it's not that Lou is selfish in that way. It's just he knows how to get a laugh, and he knows how to work with other actors and work with them to get a laugh. He's in a comedy team. He knows how to work with other comedians or even other straight men. The bland parade of leading men that they had in these movies, all of them knew that, Bud and Lou were the stars, and you were there to, work with them, and they did that. This guy feels like he's trying to be part of the act, and it's not working for me. It's just not. And again, that's just the feeling I get. I never read anything that there was any kind of problems on the set or anything like that. But it's just the feeling I get. So all told, Lost in Alaska is not the worst Abbott and Costello movie out there. Yeah, again, I think it had some interesting setups. I think it had some interesting concepts, and it did some fun things with them. I feel like if they'd followed through with some of those, this would have been a very different picture, and we'd be talking about it with a little bit more reverence than it's getting. As it stands, I feel like it's a kind of a halfway realized vision, which, you know, that's not a totally bad thing. It's a decent enough outing. It was entertaining, and one of the things I did appreciate, just real quick, as an Alaskan, is that they got the names of the places correct. They pronounced them correctly and actually had real names. A lot of films that take place in Alaska and clearly aren't filmed there either make up places that don't exist, or they mispronounce the names so badly that you're like, no one from Alaska would mispronounce that. You know, that's just... So I appreciate that they actually did that. You know, what's funny about this is that they did an episode of their radio show called Lost in Alaska. And they had some bits in there using the place names like Nome. And the plot of that one was Lou's uncle had sent them a letter saying he'd struck gold and he needed help, and they do this whole thing. But, oh, Uncle Mike's in Alaska. So, Nome? Well, of course I know him. He's my Uncle Mike, isn't he? It's very funny to me they didn't bring that one back out. I don't know the exact dates of when that show premiered versus when this movie was made, so it might have been afterwards, but it felt like there was some stuff in that radio show that they probably could have transferred over. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So, decent enough outing, but not as strong as some of the others. So, when we return, Bud and Lou jump back to their own production companies. This time it's Bud's production company putting up the money, and we have a rare artifact in Abbott and Costello history, as we are going to take a look at their first and only completely color picture. And Abbott and Costello are going to get a real treat. One of the things that we've mentioned here, and one of the things they had a lot of issue with, is their lack of compelling co-stars. They were some of the biggest draws in Hollywood, and yet they did not ever really appear against other big draws, which was not uncommon for the time. You know, people didn't cross over into different genres the way they do now. But they are finally going to get their wish and work with a real powerful star, the great actor Charles Laughton, who apparently was a great fan of theirs and really wanted to work with them. And finally, all the stars are going to align, and they are going to get their wish, because when next we meet, Abbott and Costello will not only meet Charles Laughton, but they will set sail on the 7 seas for pirate adventure when Abbott and Costello meet Captain Kidd. So, thank you very much for joining me, and as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.